Is Sri Lanka's economy on the verge of collapse? Find out in this video as we explore the country's $50 billion debt crisis, its causes and possible solutions. Join us to uncover the implications of this crisis on Sri Lanka, the region and the world. Sri Lanka's debt crisis has its roots in the country's long and bloody civil war that lasted from 1983 to 2009. The war pitted the government forces against the separatist liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam, who fought for an independent state for the ethnic Tamil minority in the north and east of the island. The war claimed more than 100,000 lives and displaced millions of people, and also devastated the country's infrastructure, economy and social fabric. To rebuild the war-torn country, Sri Lanka embarked on an ambitious development program that involved large-scale infrastructure projects such as highways, ports, airports, power plants and stadiums. To finance these projects, Sri Lanka borrowed heavily from foreign lenders, especially China, which offered low-interest loans and generous terms. China also saw Sri Lanka as a strategic partner in its Belt and Road Initiative, a global network of infrastructure and trade links that aims to expand China's influence and connectivity. However, Sri Lanka's development strategy soon proved to be unsustainable and risky. Many of the infrastructure projects were overpriced, underutilized or unprofitable and failed to generate enough revenue or growth to repay the loans. Sri Lanka also faced a series of political and economic shocks, such as constructional crisis in 2018, a terrorist attack in 2019, and the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 that further eroded its fiscal and foreign exchange reserves. As a result, Sri Lanka found itself in a debt trap, unable to service its debt obligations and facing the risk of default or debt restructuring. China is widely seen as the main creditor and the main culprit of Sri Lanka's debt crisis. China is the largest lender to Sri Lanka, accounting for about 10% of its total external debt and about 25% of its total foreign debt service payments. China has lent Sri Lanka more than $8 billion since 2010, mostly for infrastructure projects under the BRI. Some of the most controversial and costly projects include the Hambantota Port, the Matala Airport, the Colombo Port City, and the Narochalai Power Plant. China's loan to Sri Lanka have been criticized for being predatory, opaque, and politically motivated. Critics argue that China has exploited Sri Lanka's post-war vulnerability and offered loans that are unfavorable to Sri Lanka, such as high interest rates, short repayment periods, and collateral requirements. Critics also claim that China has hidden the true cost and risk of their loans and has bypassed the proper legal and environmental regulations and standards. Critics further allege that China has used its economic leverage to influence Sri Lanka's political and strategic decisions, such as supporting China's position on international issues, granting China access to Sri Lanka's strategic assets and resources, and aligning Sri Lanka with China's interests and values. The most glaring example of China's alleged debt trap diplomacy is the case of the Hambantota Port, a $1.5 billion project that was built by a Chinese company and financed by a Chinese loan. The port, located in the southern tip of Sri Lanka, was envisioned as a key hub for trade and tourism, but turned out to be a white elephant with low traffic and revenue. In 2017, Sri Lanka was forced to lease the port and 15,000 acres of land around it to China for 99 years in exchange for reducing its debt by $1.1 billion. The deal sparked outrage and protests in Sri Lanka and raised concerns over China's military and geopolitical ambitions in the Indian Ocean. The IMF is a multilateral institution that provides financial assistance to countries facing balance of payment or debt problems. Since 1978, it has provided Sri Lanka with 16 loan programs totaling about $6.5 billion. Supporters argue that the IMF has helped Sri Lanka overcome economic challenges and crises by providing timely and adequate financial support and technical assistance. Critics claim that the IMF has worsened Sri Lanka's economic situation and sovereignty by imposing harsh and unrealistic austerity measures and structural adjustments. India has been an important player in Sri Lanka's debt crisis due to their close relationship as neighbors and largest trading partners. India has a complex history with Sri Lanka, having been involved in the country's civil war and military intervener. They have a vested interest in Sri Lanka's stability and security, especially given China's growing presence in the region. India has provided Sri Lanka with about $2.5 billion in loans since 2010, mainly for development and humanitarian projects. While some view India's loans as friendly and developmental, Others argue that they are competitive and strategic, aimed at challenging China's influence in Sri Lanka. The most notable example of this is the East Container Terminal project at Colombo Port, which was initially agreed to be jointly developed by Sri Lanka, India, and Japan in 2019, but was later cancelled and instead offered to a Chinese company in 2021. The decision sparked a diplomatic row and raised questions about Sri Lanka's credibility as a partner. The debt crisis in Sri Lanka involves several significant actors, including the European Union and Japan. The European Union has provided approximately $500 million to Sri Lanka since 2010, primarily for humanitarian and development aid. But there are mixed opinions on the effectiveness of these loans. Supporters argue that the EU has been flexible and respectful, assisting in post-war recovery and reconciliation, while critics claim that the EU has been demanding and inconsistent in its approach, particularly with the generalized scheme of Preferences Plus. This trade preference scheme, which grants Sri Lanka duty-free access to the EU market for certain products, has been suspended and restrained due to Sri Lanka's human rights record. On the other hand, Japan has lent Sri Lanka around $4 billion since 2010, mostly for infrastructure and development projects, and is viewed as a reliable concessional and developmental lender and partner. Supporters argue that Japan has provided long-term and low-interest loans and has contributed to Sri Lanka's economic and social development by supporting vital sectors and areas. Sri Lanka's debt crisis involves various actors, including the World Bank, which has lent $3 billion to the country since 2010 for social and environmental projects. Supporters argue that the World Bank has helped improve the well-being of Sri Lanka's poor and vulnerable by providing transparent and respectful loans and grants that are accountable and sustainable. However, critics claim that the World Bank has been demanding, intrusive, and ineffective in its delivery and impact of loans. The government of Sri Lanka, as the borrower and policy maker, is the most responsible and accountable actor in managing and resolving the debt crisis. The government has been praised for being proactive, decisive, and inclusive in its response to the crisis, such as seeking debt relief and restructuring, securing new loans and grants from friendly countries and institutions, and prioritizing essential and productive spending. However, critics argue that the government has been reactive, inconsistent, and exclusive in its approach to the debt crisis, borrowing more and spending more, alienating and antagonizing creditors and donors, and hiding and manipulating information and data. Sri Lanka's debt crisis is a complex and multifaceted problem that requires a comprehensive and coordinated solution. The solution must address the root causes and the immediate symptoms of the debt crisis and must balance the short-term and long-term objectives and interests of the country. The solution also must involve and satisfy the various actors and stakeholders of the debt crisis and protect the rights and dignity of the people of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is facing a crisis with its debt and will need to take certain actions to resolve it. These actions include seeking debt relief and restructuring from creditors like China, the IMF, and the World Bank. The country must also implement structural and institutional reform to improve its economic competitiveness and resilience and address social and environmental challenges. Sri Lanka must engage in regional and international cooperation to secure financial and technical assistance, enhance trade and investment, and promote peace and security. All actions must be transparent, accountable, and consultative with stakeholders and the public. Sri Lanka's debt crisis is a serious and urgent problem that needs to be resolved as soon as possible. The debt crisis has jeopardized not only Sri Lanka's economic stability and sovereignty but also its social and political well-being and dignity. The debt crisis has also exposed and exacerbated Sri Lanka's underlying and long-standing vulnerabilities and weaknesses, such as ethnic and religious divisions, political and institutional instability, and environmental and human rights degradation. And that's it for this video. We hope you enjoyed watching it and learned something new. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to get notified of our future videos.